the main characters are women.
Something tells me, do not overdo the bag, Winnie. Let it help you along, of course, by all means, when stuck. But cast your mind forward, Winnie. Something tells me, cast your mind forward to the time when words must fail, and do not overdo the bag. Perhaps just one quick tip. You again.
Madeleine Renaud said that in Beckett's case, love and lucidity are on the same level. That is why she said Beckett understands women so well, that he understands the mind of a woman from within. And he does this brilliantly of course, in several of the works, that he can surrender in a way that very few men can surrender to the intricacies, the emotional intricacies, the labyrinthine intricacies of a womanly sensibility.
Probably the best icon for Beckett's women is this gushing orifice, the mouth in Not I.
Imagine not suffering. Indeed, could not remember offhand when she had suffered less, unless, of course, she was meant to be suffering. Thought to be suffering, just as the odd time in her life when clearly intended to be having pleasure, she was in fact having none, not the slightest, in which case, of course, that notion of punishment for some sin or other, or for the lot, or no particular reason, for its own sake, things she understood perfectly. That notion of punishment, which had first occurred to her, brought up as she had been to believe with the other waves, in a merciful God.
We watch that mouth struggling to find words that make sense of her experience as an I, and yet she's constantly thrown back to the third person, she.
What? Who? No! She! Realized words were coming. Imagine, words were coming. A voice she did not recognize at first, so long since it had sounded, then finally had to admit could be none other than her own certain vowel sounds she had never heard elsewhere, so that people would stare, the rare occasions, once or twice a year, stare at her uncomprehending. And now this stream, steady stream, she who had never...
Beckett obviously uses women in traditional ways. They become the muse. They fulfill certain stereotypic images. I don't deny that. In A.J.O., you have the woman who is the voice of conscience.
Warm summer night, all sleeping, sitting on the edge of her bed in her lavender slip. You know the one. Ah, she knew you, heavenly powers. Faint lap of sea through open window. Gets up in the end and slips out as she is. Moon, stock, down the garden and under the viaduct. Sees from the seaweed the tide is flowing. Goes on down the edge and lies down with her face in the wash. Cut a long story short, doesn't work. Gets up in the end, sopping wet, and back up to the house. Gets up the Gillette, the make you recommended for her body hair.
It's my contention that Beckett is very sensitive to gender.
This is going to be another happy day. Where was I? My hair, yes. Later on. Well, I shall be thankful for it later on. I have my hat on. I cannot take it off now.
And that, in fact, Beckett's works are gender-specific in the same way that his media plays are related to exactly the medium for which he's writing the plays. For instance, think about Happy Days. Here you have a woman stuck up to her waist in the sand, in the earth. Second act, stuck up to her neck in the earth, with her husband sitting behind her, reading his newspaper. Imagine, if you will, those roles reversed. I don't think they can be reversed. So that rather than Winnie, for instance, being a stereotype, I think Beckett's really commenting on the stereotypic roles of women. And in that way, I think Beckett's a social critic. In that way, I'd go so far as to say Beckett's a feminist, because he's calling into question why we are stuck in the roles we're stuck in.
Oh, this is a happy day. This will have been another happy day after all. So far.
I think it was 1934, he applied to study under Eisenstein in Moscow in his film school. And he is very, very interested in the cinema. And of course, his main thrust is a visual one.
When Barney Rossett decided to make 3 short films with writers that he was publishing in the States, Beckett came over here. He made a film that was just called Film, directed by Alan Schneider, who'd never made a film beforehand. Buster Keaton had no idea what he was doing and didn't think very much of it, but he was out of fashion and he had a job and he was paid, so he did it. And it is a remarkable film.
This was an idea of mine that would be nice to make film. I had done that before Grove Press. And we went and commissioned Beckett, Ionesco, Duras, and Robbe-Grillet. And of them, the only one we were able to make was film because we spent all the money on it. He was on the set. He was vitally interested in anything to do with film. He was very interested in the use of lenses. We examined one lens after another to try to get this effect that he wanted of the eye, the other, whatever. He was very, very interested in all that.
The Grips fixed a perch for him on the top of the set. They got a 12-foot ladder and nailed it in place, and Sam climbed up on the ladder and watched the proceedings from up there.
He starts off the script of film with a quotation from the Irish philosopher Bishop Berkeley, which is, to be is to be perceived, but this character doesn't want to be, So he has a character who is desperately trying not to be perceived. That's why he puts draperies around on all the windows, and he even puts something over the goldfish bowl so the goldfish won't see him.
The thing he wrote in film, the little bit of business which apparently made Keaton light up because he could get a hold of it, he could identify it, was you put the dog out and the cat comes in, you put the cat out and the dog comes in. That's a classic piece of silent comedy, but it's maybe a little bit more in Chaplin's milieu than in Keaton's.
And when he finally has removed everything, he sits in the chair thinking, now I'm no longer, I won't be there anymore. But he's still there, and he looks out, and in the corner of the room is somebody looking at him, and that's himself. And so what Beckett is saying is, the experience of being is the experience of being perceived by oneself. He said, you see, I think most writers waste people's time by writing at too great a length. And I'm trying to reduce everything to the minimum length. And he said, well, at the end of the day, my last work will be a blank piece of paper.
Much of Beckett's later dramatic work in the 70s and early 80s was written specifically for television.
And I think his increased work for television is in fact an attempt to get to a kind of poetry that doesn't need words anymore. And his latest television plays, from Ghost Trio onwards to Quad and Nacht und Träume, which is another late television play, which is, neither of those two last ones has any text at all.
In Beckett's work, and he said that many times in the past, what I'm after is shape. Quad for me is a perfect shape. No language, pure poetry, dance, geometry, mathematics, and it is the purest piece of work that he has done, I think.
During the first taping of Quad for German television in 1982, Beckett noticed a technician playing the footage back in black and white. He liked it so much that he wrote a ghostly monochromatic sequel called Quad 2.